So obviously Trey Jones, Campaign, Blake Wesley. Tell me what you think. What are your thoughts on who potentially, what the order of that could be? I know there's been a lot of talk on Twitter. Even last episode, we kind of alluded to how there are people on Twitter that were even suggesting him starting. So give me your thoughts on the point guard position.
I love Cameron Payne. I think he's an excellent veteran point guard, something that we've been talking about the Spurs needing for pretty much 2 seasons now at this point. I still think he'd be the backup point behind Trey Jones. Trey Jones took another big leap last year as a scorer, as a facilitator, really as a defender. There were rooms for improvement. Obviously, we talk about his 3-point shooting, maybe consistent finishing, strong finishing around the rim, especially with the left hand. But overall, a really solid point guard. I expect him to take another leap, especially chemistry wise with all the other players on our team. And he fits the age profile of the squad. So having Campaign be that veteran presence off the bench to be a steady hand and kind of help Malachi find his way and the rest of the young guys, Julian, alongside Doug McDermott, who's another savvy veteran, I think that'd be a dangerous bench unit. And then I think Blake Wesley, unfortunately for some of us that are big fans of his, will still see time in Austin. I think it was evident that he hasn't grown as much as maybe we would have liked during the summer league. He wasn't necessarily bad, but you would have wanted him as a first round pick last year to kind of really show up and show out, kind of like how Malachi showed up and showed out, and Julian Champagny, who was undrafted. So because of that, I think he'll still be that third string point guard. But you did forget to mention one gentleman who might not play that much, but Devonte Graham's technically a point guard
Yes,
on the
you're right.
roster.
You're right. Thank you.
You're welcome. He's a shot chucker. He might play kind of one or two. Like we saw him play both positions last year, even sometimes next to Trey, which was a really undersized backcourt. But I see his play time going down a little bit, especially with the addition of Cameron Payne. And honestly, if push came to shove, let's say Cam Payne and Trey Jones were kind of injured, I would probably give Blake more play time over Devonte, only because I would. They both have their deficiencies, and I'd like to throw Blake in the fire over Devonte Graham if that were the choice. But yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that would be an interesting prospect. I think my question is, Ethan, and I'm so glad you mentioned that because I did forget Devonte Graham, is a lot of these guys, that we'll be talking about today, at least like, 3 of them will be
Mm-hmm.
cut.
Yeah.
I believe because you have 18 guys on your roster now, including two ways. 3 of those will be two ways. On top of your 15 guys, your 3 at each position. Well, sometimes people do other positions, but just for conversational purposes, 3 at each position, and then your two-way guys. So yeah, but going back to the point guards though, Ethan, I think for me, I mean, obviously you covered most of it. The question is there really? I think for me is there a chance Campaign starts? I would say I would think initially no, just because of the way that the Spurs do things. And I've talked about this before. It also depends on what happens with the point guard position. Maybe there is a world where Jeremy Sohan is the starting point guard. Where like we've mentioned in other episodes, and I'll say it again too, as much as I've kind of tooted that horn as the offseason has continued, I've had a little internal reminder of myself, just like how many times we've done this, Ethan, and how many times, like, not to necessarily, like, we weren't even really off last time. We just had KBD starting instead of Jeremy Sohan. But the year prior, I think we might have gone a little bit more out there. Obviously, that was a different circumstance, but it just seems like for as much as we speculate on what the lineups are going to be, when you add a player like Victor, it's just like, I, first of all, it's already hard to predict Pop. And when you have somebody like that coming in, it just almost makes it more of a crapshoot. And maybe we end up being right on
Mm-hmm.
the money. But my confidence in just me knowing or being for certain about anything rotationally has just kind of decreased as we've continued to be back in the offseason. I think it's just kind of because as time progresses, like you kind of get a little bit of an internal reminder. Like now that all the hype's done, it's like you can kind of come back to reality a little bit. And that's kind of why I'm a little bit more, maybe there is a chance that like Campaign gets in the starting lineup just because he has that veteran experience. Obviously Trey has a lot of experience, but he doesn't have the reps in playoff games or on the team that Campaign has. And also maybe Pop's just like Campaign can run the offense, similarly to Trey, and we think Trey would fit better with the backup unit. Maybe we think Trey's ceiling is going to be a 6-man anyway. Let's, campaign as the placeholder for this season, and now we can kind of move him to that role so that he can just, kind of be more entrenched in it if that's how they view him moving forward. um
Yeah.
Obviously diving deep, but that's why we're calling this a roster breakdown. There's just a lot of different possibilities that could potentially happen there. And I know I could go in every position and say that, but I think that really is like a realistic conversation that could be had by the Spurs. But it could ultimately be we want a little bit of campaign scoring juice off the bench more. Trey knows the system. We'll roll with him at the starting. Or maybe I'm wrong on both, and it's Jeremy at the starting point guard because they want
Mhm.
everybody, the most talent in that starting lineup. And Pop really was being, very blunt in the press conference last year when he said that, it's saying that
Mhm.
Jeremy is a point guard. What are kind of your thoughts on what I said there?
They're all possibilities, and I don't have anything to sway you in one way or the other, Jude. Because, like you said, Popovich is just a conundrum, and he will decide on a whim. It feels like what he wants to do. Obviously, it's not on a whim. He's the smartest, winningest coach of all time. Um, but as far as Jeremy playing at point guard, every day I think of that less and less as a
Yeah.
possibility, only because I feel like it would be. I feel like you need a natural point guard with Wemby, at least at first,
Yeah.
to
No, I
kind of
agree.
ease that
That's why I'm
transition.
talking about this more. As much
Yeah,
as I've pushed that, and I still like that, really,
me
like
too.
I feel like that has the highest potential, like just for a lineup. And we may still see that, but is that going to be the starting lineup? Like you said, I've kind of been on that same train.
Yeah, and as far as campaign starting, I have no problem with that. The most profound point that you made in my eyes is that Trey Jones is the future 6-man backup point guard. Like that's what we see his ceiling as being. So why not just make that a thing now? Like that's a really good point and something that I did not think about. And let campaign be that placeholder. I have no argument against that point, other than that Trey has good chemistry with the starters. But if it's
Right.
inevitable, it's inevitable.
Yeah, and there's still going to be an adjustment for Victor, as we saw in the summer league games, but at the same time, adding him to the roster makes it a little bit easier to move around the rest of your pieces. You know
Yeah,
what I'm saying when
for
you
sure.
have him on the court. And so the other thing that I just want to hit on there to end before we go on to shooting guards, Ethan, is like you were saying, like how it is a lot of possibilities, but like it's like that's a realistic conversation. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
And he's the only one that has, I mean, say what you will about DeAndre Ayton, he's the only one that has real experience with like a big that is this like a
A
real
former number one
centerpiece.
pick big.
Yeah, yeah. And he has good chemistry with big, especially in pick and roll situations. That was like where he shined in Phoenix's offense last year.
Yeah. And as much as DeAndre Ayton isn't going to be as much of a 3-point shooter, or isn't as much of a 3-point shooter as Wemby will be,
Hmm.
the pick and pop in the mid range is something we saw in the summer league that got him going, and that's still something that the point is that's the play that pops out in my mind when I think about campaign and pick and pops with the Suns, and that's definitely something that can translate to Wembanyama, hopefully, at least at the worst, like you said, he has experience there.
Yes.
Um, so I mean, I guess the other takeaway from this when it comes to Devonte Graham is as we've mentioned in other videos, when it comes to cuts, he's going to have to prove himself in training camp. But at the same time, he was a part of that group that traveled with the team to
Hmm.
Las Vegas with Wembanyama. So, I mean, with the Spurs, Ethan, as much as we just did that whole segment on campaign, I really could see a world where Devonte Graham beats him out. I don't think that that's going to happen. I know that sounds crazy. Like when it comes to just what we've seen on the court, I understand objectively everything points to campaign. But when it comes to the Spurs and how they run things, like
Yeah.
the 5% chance that happens, still lives in my brain just with the context surrounding him. Now, granted,
Yeah.
he also had the DWI, so maybe he was just there for some promo and was on the team right then and was like, I'll go with y'all.
Yeah.
But also there was a team get together where Wembenyama stayed back and practiced with everybody instead of competing in the California Classic. So you don't want to read too much into social media, but that is the one like Spurs thing, honestly, in the past, like probably like since like DeJounte going to work out with Kawhi in San Diego. Do you remember that way
Yeah.
back in the day? Like
Hmm.
that's probably the biggest like social media, like something that appears on social media that was a real event that you can actually take something away from in Spurs world, because
Yeah.
they kept him back to get reps with the guys and get advice from everybody who'd been in the league for a while. So there was a reason that they had that specific group around him.
I don't want to give light to founded perspective, like unfounded stories or narratives.
Yeah,
But another thing to keep in mind is Campaign is like the only guy that we've brought in that hasn't acknowledged the Spurs pretty much in any way, to my knowledge. I don't know if you've seen
really.
anything, but I've checked his Instagram and his Twitter and everything, and there's like no, you would almost not even know that he was traded.
And that could be maybe he doesn't even want to play for us.
That's what I'm saying. That could be more
you
likely
know,
than him being beat out by the Devonte. He's just like, I don't want to be here. Cut me. Let me go to
and it's a $6 million
wherever.
expiring contract. So as much as that placeholder role works perfect, he's been on a contender. He's 28. He's in his prime. He might want to go be the backup point guard for the Clippers. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like just because or I say the Clippers, or whatever team has a chance at contending. Maybe the Heat. Maybe he wants to go sign with a minimum with the Heat. They just
Maybe
lost Gabe
Gabe
Vincent.
Vincent. Hmm.
So there's a lot of potential suitors for that for sure. And it's not like taking a minimum this year would have. I mean, he was only going to make 6 million. I mean, I say only. Obviously, all of that money is incredible, but when we're talking about NBA players, this would be the year to go get the minimum, because you weren't, and then maybe try to make more next off season, because you're only going to make 6 million this year anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it's a possibility. I don't
I'm
want to put
glad.
words into his mouth because hopefully he's like super pumped and he's just not a social media guy. But you never know.
That's a very good point, and that wasn't something that I had seen yet, Ethan. And when you talk about, like I said, I was talking about that get together, you can take something away from that. This is another thing where I would say, I would just watch that, because that could be an indicator that he wants a buyout. But I mean, I didn't even know you could really get that nitty gritty into the point guard seat. That obviously this is the name of the episode, but still, like
Yeah, that was a lot.
I wasn't anticipating getting that in the weeds. But that's what we're here for.